afternoon. Hello, it is noon, and we want our presenter to have as much time as possible, and also all of you to have as much time as possible. We anticipate trying to leave about 30 minutes at the end, so 45-minute presentation, thereabouts, and then lots of time for questions. We were going to do the cards, but we think this is a well-behaved, manageable group. So what I'll do is, once I'm done with the introduction, or once Art's getting towards the end of his presentation, I'll just have a microphone and go around and do Phil Donahue like we've done in the past, and just raise your hand so that I can get to the next person. So it's really gratifying to see that we have so many people interested in this presentation on how to fix the potholes in the City of Beloit. I'm Nick Damasis. I'm the director of the Beloit Public Library. And again, welcome to all of you. I want to thank our sponsors for this Civics Academy series. There's a lot of familiar faces, but some of you are here for the first time. Go on our website, the library's website, Civics Academy. All kinds of information. What we do is we film the presenters, we put their PowerPoint up on the website as well. Information, you can go back and look at it. Oftentimes previous ones we've had, Eric Miller's here, the finance director for the city. He's presented 2 or 3 times, and you can see where your tax dollars are going, what the budget is about, and that. So go check those out. This is another important one in civics education for the Civics Academy. The real title is AI Accurate Information about Data Centers, Economic, Energy, and Environmental Impacts. One of the keys of our program is government transparency, but also civic responsibility. And that is, if we're not educated on how these things work and how the government works and all that, then we ourselves are going to feed misinformation and not be ready for the kind of transparency that government may be showing. Future topic, we were just talking earlier, maybe NDAs. NDAs would be a really good topic for why are those, how are they used, what's the purpose for governments, and the pros and cons and the limitations in that. So I think that may be a very appropriate topic. I met Art recently at a statewide committee, library committee that I'm on. And it was at UW Milwaukee, and he came and talked to our group. Our group makes recommendations to the Department of Public Instruction superintendent. And so he came to talk to us about AI, and I just thought it was the best presentation I've seen in terms of putting this kind of issue into perspective, and not just for libraries, but overall, and especially for communities. And so he's the lawyer for his credentials. Lawyer practicing environmental and energy law at Godfrey Kahn, adjunct professor at Marquette University, teaching energy law since 2012, and most important, former president of the Milwaukee Public Library and the library board. And that, of course, caught my ear, and that got me thinking a little bit about my professional responsibility for libraries and how AI affects that. So I'm going to give a few random thoughts here. Driving back from Minneapolis last night, I thought about the internet. The internet was started, of course, in the 1960s for military reasons. It was DARPA, out of DARPA. And it was, if you think of the information superhighway, so military vehicles could be driving on that highway. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN started the World Wide Web for academic and research purposes. So now academics and research could start sharing articles in that. 1994, they made that available to the public. Now we have all that traffic. All of us can get onto the World Wide Web. And of course, we are insatiable. We are consumers, and we wanted more and more and more, and we wanted it faster and faster. Netscape came along and put everything, made sense of it, and said, now we can make it available to all of you. It was kind of the Wild West. I think most of you remember this time. And one of the first search engines, 2 guys out of Stanford, put together a search engine so that it could kind of make sense of that Wild West, and that was Yahoo. And it was structured in the sense of the way that a cataloging department structures a library. Hierarchies, indexes, directories, trying to put it into categories. 2 other guys from Stanford came along not long after and said, forget about all that. People just want to walk up to a reference librarian and say, I want to know how high Mount McKinley is. And that's how I say it, natural language, and that's Google. And Google came along, and that kind of started to take things over. It expanded. People thought democracy is going to just take off now because everyone has this information. No more hiding information, no more behind walls, no more conspiracies, because everything's going to be right out into the open. But then we had the Great Firewall of China, as they called it, which was in the early 2000s, that was able to choke off, put checkpoints on that highway, and be able to control information. And we've seen that not only is it used for democratic purposes, I think like this topic is also used for democratic purposes of gathering people and getting them together, but it's also been used for nefarious purposes. And the question is, what is credible? And libraries have always had an important role in that. Journals and magazines, we've seen them drop off quite a bit. When I was in graduate school, 2000, 2002, there was a database called Dialogue. And we took a whole class on this, on how to search a database. And the teacher said, you get 3 searches. It costs $150 a search to search for a newspaper article or a journal article. So this is what you get in the class, and it's $150. It's included in your tuition, but don't do any more than that. And at that same time then, publishers started breaking off and said, why are we paying this company Dialogue when we start our own? And then you get publishers starting their own database. Anybody in academia knows the different Sage, ProQuest, and all the others that have come out of that. Paper periodicals went fast, as we all want it fast and in our own comfortable spaces. Books, we want digitally. Libraries have responded to that. Movies and music, we want streaming. We don't want to have to come in and get a VHS or now a DVD or anything physical. We want it streaming. So consumer demand influences the market, and the market influences what libraries provide. And now we have this blob called AI. In 1985, I was taking an undergraduate class on AI, artificial intelligence. And the class had nothing to do with computers. It was a philosophy class. And it looked at who and what we are, and what does an artificial intelligence mean in relation to human intelligence, and more important, what does it mean to us as human beings? And this is the role, the way that I look at it through the library, is what does it mean to all of you? Artificial intelligence, information, all the things that Art will be talking about today. 40 years later, of course, we're asking, what do we do with this thing called AI, which technology and resource consumption-wise seems as insatiable as we consumers are for what it provides us. It's a multifaceted topic that generates as much heat as the facilities themselves, and I'm delighted that Art Harrington is here to provide us with some cooling context and intelligent perspective. Art Harrington.
Well, since we're in a library, I think it's appropriate to start with a quote. The infinity machine, Demis Hassabis, Deep Mind, and the Quest for Superintelligence by Sebastian Malle. I'm going to read the first paragraph. This book is about intelligence. On the one hand, it is a portrait of a remarkable human, a chess prodigy, a Nobel laureate, a polymath thinker. On the other hand, it tells the story of his quest to build remarkable machines, systems that are intuitive, creative, and even original. At some point in the not too distant future, artificial intelligence will beat human intelligence at almost every mental task. And to say this marks a watershed would be a parody of understatement. Artificial intelligence heralds a transformation more profound than anything since Homo sapiens acquired the capacity for abstract thought some 70,000 years ago. This is the book on the path to artificial intelligence today. I thought it was appropriate, on the heels of what Nick talked about, to start my presentation with that quote. A little bit about me. I think Nick has given you some highlights. I've taught an energy course since 2012. I practice in the environmental energy area at a law firm in Milwaukee, Godfrey Kahn. And as Nick indicated, I have a soft spot in my heart for libraries and the function. And I'm just so impressed coming into this facility and seeing what the community has built here, and the support for this facility is remarkable. And I'm privileged to be here. But I want to start a little bit by reading something that I prepared. So just bear with me. Let me start by stepping back for a moment, because the issues we are discussing today are really the result of two major transformations over the past 2 decades. First, the extraordinary growth of the technology center. Nick hinted to this. Companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, and now AI-driven companies, powered by firms like NVIDIA, have grown to trillion-dollar valuations, in some cases exceeding the GDP of entire countries. That growth has been fueled by an explosion in data, cloud computing, streaming, enterprise software, and now artificial intelligence. But all of that digital activity depends on something very physical: massive networks of data centers filled with servers that must run continuously, and this is important, 24/7. In other words, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a recent New York Times article, the paper described the impending data center infrastructure this way, and I want to read. This was on Sunday's New York Times. Bear with me, I'm going to read about 3 paragraphs. Behind each leap in AI are corresponding jumps in computer power. Today, there are about 20 million AI chips crammed into data centers that underpin the technology's growth abilities and usage worldwide, according to the research firm Epic AI. That figure is expected to double roughly every 9 months, putting the world in a place to have about 200 million of the chips by the end of 2028. That's 10 times current levels. In size and ambition, this moment compares to the building of the railroads in the 1800s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, and the Manhattan Project to create an atomic weapon in the 1940s, technologists say. This, quote, is the largest scale infrastructure build-out in the history of humanity, said Bob Watson, a co-founder of the microchip firm Etched, which has raised more than $1 billion to meet the growing demand for AI components. Bear with me, one last paragraph. Peter DeSantis, who leads foundational AI models at Amazon, which provides computing power to the AI firms Anthropic, OpenAI, and others, said the Seattle company has doubled its computing capacity since 2022 and will double it again by next year. His quote is, "It's hard to get your mind around this scale." The second thing I want to indicate with this rise in technology, we're seeing the beginning of a fundamental shift in how we generate and deliver energy. For nearly a century, our system was built, this is the electrical system, around large centralized fossil fuel-based generation. But over the past 20 years, as all of you are aware, we have been seeing a rapid growth in wind and solar, advances in battery storage, and increasing pressure on decarbonizing the grid. You're all experiencing this being in Alliance territory and all the solar and wind that's going in. These are 2 profound changes, and what's important for today's discussion, they're now colliding. This rapid expansion of data centers in creating an immediate and significant surge in demand for electricity on a scale that in some cases rivals that of small cities or even regions. At the same time, we're in the midst of transforming the very system that is supposed to supply that energy. And energy is only part of the story. These facilities also require substantial amounts of water for cooling, raising additional questions about resources use, environmental impacts, and long-term sustainability, particularly as both data centers and the generation facilities they serve are expanding. Here in Wisconsin, these issues are no longer theoretical. Proposed data center projects will require multiple gigawatts of continuous power, along with significant supporting infrastructure. Utilities are seeking approval to build new generation, transmission, and distribution assets, and to develop new rate structures tailored to these very large customers. This brings us to the central set of questions I'll be exploring with you today. How do we plan for and build the infrastructure needed to meet that demand? Who should bear the costs and the risks associated with that investment? How do we balance the economic benefits of data centers, of development, with fairness to all of the residents who are impacted by it? On the one hand, data centers bring jobs, investment, and tax-based growth. On the other hand, they raise questions legitimately about cost allocations, long-term risks, and environmental impacts, particularly if demand projections change or technology evolves over time. And that last point is worth emphasizing. Energy infrastructure is built to last decades, but the technologies and business models driving data center demand are evolving very quickly. If those projections shift, or if newer, more efficient technologies emerge, we could find ourselves dealing with underutilized assets and difficult questions about who ultimately pays. So today, my goal is to not take sides. I want to provide you with background information to better understand these trade-offs. I also hope to engage you into a discussion on questions you have about my presentation. Now here's the outline of what I would like to cover, but we have limited time. I want to talk about the race of AI supremacy between China and the United States. I want to give you an overview of the financial attraction of data centers for municipalities, give you an overview of the projections for electrification demand from data centers and other sources of future demand, talk a little bit about the transition from a hydrocarbon energy to renewable energy and how this transformation complicates the need to serve data centers. I also want to give you some future projections of utility projects to meet this demand, describe the current and evolving technology for cooling these centers. What are the changes in state tax laws that's bringing these data centers in? I want to talk about that a little bit. I also want to talk about how does Wisconsin and federal public utility law complicate decisions about serving energy to data centers. This is a very, very complex area. Explain the concept of stranded costs and the risks of stranded costs to rate-paying public. Provide an overview of some recent PSC decisions on the utilities who want to serve data centers and how those cost allocations are occurring. I also want to provide the unresolved issues that are outstanding with transmission projects to serve these data centers. and talk a little bit about some of the emerging issues about noise and ambient temperatures associated with data centers. And if time permits, I have some ideas about how these should be resolved in a community with all these issues when you are approaching developers on these projects. That's a tall order, but I'm going to try to get through it. So on the first issue about the race for supremacy on AI between China and the United States, I'm going to read some remarks that I prepared for this, and just listen, it's about 2-3 paragraphs. One reason we're seeing so much data center development is that artificial intelligence has become an international competition, particularly between the United States and China. And AI is not simply software. It requires advanced chips, enormous computing facilities, and enormous amounts of electricity. The United States remains a leader. We have the world's largest concentration of data centers even today, and continue to produce some of the leading AI models. But China has rapidly narrowed the technology gap. China has important potential advantages. Its ability to build electricity infrastructure is extraordinarily quick. The two countries have very different energy portfolios. United States, we have natural gas currently supplies about 41% of our electricity. Renewables, solar, wind, battery storage, is about 24%. But don't forget nuclear, that's 18%, excuse me. We have abundant natural gas, the world's largest nuclear fleet. We have the world's largest nuclear fleet existing in the world in the United States right now. We're rapidly growing wind and solar resources, battery storage, and potentially small nuclear reactors in the next decade. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. China today relies most heavily on coal, including for data centers. But China is simultaneously building solar, wind, and nuclear generation at an extraordinary scale. In 2025 alone, it added more than 450 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity. We're going to talk a little bit about what that term means. And roughly half of the nuclear capacity presently under construction in the world is in China. So just think about this now in terms of the electrical resources needed for these data centers and what China's doing. So one of the issues in the AI competition may ultimately be an electricity competition, not simply who can invest the best computer model, but who can build the chips, the data centers, generation and transmission necessary to operate these models at scale. That does not mean every proposed data center should be approved. Local questions about water, electricity, noise, land use, and cost are legitimate and need to be examined carefully. But it does mean that when communities such as Beloit debate these projects, they are participating in a much larger national discussion about how and where the physical infrastructure of the AI economy will be built. So let me talk a little bit about the financial attraction of data centers. And I'm going to be a little bit more extemporaneous now. I want to set the stage for the, I think, important issues that you need to think about in this community and nationally. It's no surprise to anyone that municipalities are constrained by existing statutes in Wisconsin that limit the way municipalities can obtain revenue. Their almost sole source of revenue generation is what? Tax. Property taxes. And if you are in an urban area that is constrained, there is an exception for allowing, and there's also overlay on that, there are limitations on how much you can tax. But there are exemptions for new construction. So when you look at data centers as new construction with projected tax revenues in excess of $20 million over the lifetime, you can understand why municipalities are interested in this as a source of revenue to meet public needs given these constraints that the municipalities are under. I just mentioned that because this is a reality and why you see so much interest in municipalities in Wisconsin because of these limitations and how you can get revenue to support public needs. Now let's talk a little bit about the overview of projections for electrical demand from data centers and other sources of future demand. I said I teach an energy course. The utilities, up until 5 years ago, were panicking. Why were they panicking? Demand was dropping significantly. You've lived through all this in Beloit, knowing how manufacturing has slowed down. The manufacturers were the big source of demand for utilities. Think about the paper companies in the Fox Valley and what's happened with migration of work to China, etc. Demand was decreasing. This was a huge problem for the utilities. Suddenly, this demand is surfacing overnight from data centers. But let me give you an idea of the amount of demand that is coming from these data centers. And I'm going to focus just on We Energy's territory, which is the largest service utility territory in the state, more or less the eastern part of the state. Their total demand in that area is 5.1 gigawatts of electricity today. We have a new data center in that territory in Mount Pleasant. Microsoft, it's operational today. Vantage is building a brand new data center in the city of Port Washington. When those two data centers come online, they're going to double the demand in We Energy's territory. 5.1 additional gigawatts of demand. That's the equivalent of 4 million homes. So think a little bit about this if you're a utility and you're figuring about how are you going to meet this demand. Now let's switch a little bit now to this transformation from coal, baseload facilities to renewable energy. You've all experienced this, right? Alliant is a big proponent. We Energies has built huge amount of infrastructure. There's a lot of pressure to shut down the coal plants, the natural gas plants, and transition to solar and wind. That was not too difficult when demand was decreasing. Think about data centers. I mentioned the term 24/7. What's the problem with wind and solar if you're going to transition from baseload coal plants? They do not provide a constant supply of energy. They only operate when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. So this is a challenge, and now we're seeing tremendous incentives to start up natural gas plants to deal with this issue. We Energies is seeking approval for 3 natural gas startup plants in its territory to deal with this intermittent transition from coal plants to solar and wind. This transformation is creating enormous challenges logistically in the utilities when we're talking about this demand. Now, I teach an energy course. I brought in a woman who is responsible for all the PSC approvals in We Energy's territory for the new energy facilities. She came into my class last spring. I teach at Marquette. And I asked her to give a presentation of the facilities planning for the next 5 years for We Energies. So this was last spring, so it was 2026 to 2030. And these are projected facilities approvals that they are going to get in the next 4 years for energy infrastructure to deal with this demand. The total amount was $20 billion. I want to repeat that. This was last year. This is one utility in the state that has 5 investor-owned utilities. That utility is talking about $20 billion of new energy infrastructure. This is unheard of. It is something that I would never seen in my 12 years of teaching this course. It is earth-shattering, and it is going to create huge policy issues with the Public Service Commission. Now, let's switch a little bit about current and evolving technology for cooling data centers. I'm living in the Milwaukee area, and the two data centers that are the big ones I talked about, where are they getting their water from? Lake Michigan, okay? Tremendous concern about water use. Whether it's legitimate or not when you're taking water from Lake Michigan and the utilities are looking for additional revenues, nonetheless, the developers say, okay, we're hearing you on the water issue, we're gonna recycle the water, okay? So we're not gonna use as much water as if we took it directly and discharged it back to the lake. What's required when you recycle water in a data center for cooling? You've got to have a huge amount of fans, and you have to have chillers, all of which take additional energy because of those cooling systems. Now, I make it a point in my course to try to follow emerging technology. There is a company called Liquid Cooling. They have a new technology that puts a coolant solvent directly on the chips. So you don't need, and it's a closed loop system. It takes the heat off of that, and it reduces the energy demand by reducing the amount of fans and all the aisle spaces you need. Tremendous opportunity. There's concern right now today because the chip manufacturers are concerned about contacts with the chips. But this is like an example of how emerging technology can, and that technology would dramatically reduce the amount of energy. That's just one example of what I'm talking about, how quickly this technology is changing, and how does this impact the energy infrastructure you are building that's going to last 20 years to meet demand when this technology is changing so quickly. Just an example. So why are all these data centers coming to Wisconsin and to Virginia and to other states? In the 24-25 budget, there is buried in that budget is a sales tax exemption for data centers. Wisconsin's not alone on this. Virginia's done this, a number of others, and the idea is to, incentivize these large construction projects. I mean, these are billion-dollar construction projects, lots of jobs, right? Lots of income coming in, which you can tax. But the sales tax exemption applies to everything in construction and everything that's connected with construction, and for the life of the facility for operating and replacing equipment. That's exempt from sales tax. The Fiscal Bureau has just come back with an estimate of the future lost revenues just from that exemption of $2 billion for the state. Now, it's not fair to just focus in on that, because the legislator is saying we're going to have a lot of construction jobs, people are going to be able to make enormous amount of salaries, we're going to get income tax on that, so there's a lot of yin and yang here. But I just want people to appreciate one of the reasons a lot of the data centers are attracted to Wisconsin is because of this big sales tax exemption. So I just wanted to plant that seed in you in terms of understanding why there's so much interest. Now, another complication. Everybody's looking to the Public Service Commission. Why aren't you kind of controlling all of this? You are a state agency. You're the center for all the energy infrastructure that's going in and who's going to pay for it. And in my view, the Public Service Commission is doing a great job on figuring out how to cost allocate these projects. And I could go into a lot of detail here, but they have just gone and gave decisions about various tariffs that utilities want to provide for these data centers for new construction. And I can tell you the common theme from the Public Service Commission is the data centers have to pay for this. not the ratepayers. I can go into a lot of detail. This is complicated discussion. Citizens Utility Board was very involved in these issues and actually did a great job on behalf of residential customers as well as small retailers watching these issues. So I just will say that, but here's the complication. The regulation of energy is incredibly complex. The Public Service Commission is only one of about 5 different agencies that deal with energy infrastructure for data centers. Transmission, everybody's familiar with transmission, right? Bringing power in from other states to serve Wisconsin and large users like data centers. People are surprised to understand that the Public Service Commission has nothing to do with the cost allocation for those transmissions. That's done by the Federal Energy Commission. That's FERC out of Washington. And if you listen to what's happening out of Washington, D.C. now with the Trump administration, they want to fast track these issues. They want to make sure that these get in quickly. That's a national issue. But the siting of the transmission, not who pays for the transmission, but the siting of the transmission is under the authorization of the Public Service Commission, Wisconsin. It's a little bifurcated situation. But if that's not complicated enough, there's a separate reliability council that deals with how and what the utilities have to do to create reliability and security. Those are 2 separate agencies. So this is, I teach this course, people can't comprehend the complexity of this. There is no easy answer. It's a very complex area about how energy is regulated. And I just want you to appreciate that the governor can't stand up, whoever's elected, and say, here's how we're going to pay for all this transmission and everything. There's all different agencies. Some are federal, some are state, some are these independent commissions. So it's a very complex area. I just want to explain something. So why am I also talking about the fact that we're building these energy facilities that could last 20 years, right? I mean, you put in large scale natural gas plants, you look at the coal-fired plant, We Energies built the largest capital intensive construction project in 2000, 2007, 2008. Anybody know what that was? It was the largest coal generation facility in the state. It was built in Oak Creek. That has a useful life of 20 years, all right? They also had a coal plant in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. That was about 10 years old. They shut down the Pleasant Prairie facility, and what happened? When you are approved for putting in a 20-year useful life of a facility, the utilities are given a guaranteed bargain, as they should be. They're a regulated utility. When you put in a facility, you should be paying over time your reimbursed costs for building that over time. So it says useful life of 20 years. If you shut down that facility early, there are what is called stranded costs that are owed by the ratepayers to the utility if you close it early. So why am I mentioning all this? This was a big issue dealing with the Pleasant Prairie plant when they shut that down early. And the ratepayers, not only just the Citizens Utility Board, but large manufacturers, printers, paper companies were saying, why should we have to pay that stranded cost? You made a decision and it was approved to be shut down. This should not be a ratepayer issue, but it is, folks, because the deal is when you build long-term generation facilities, they're paid over time, and if they're shut down early, the ratepayers have to pay it. So why am I focusing on this? A big issue with data centers is how long are these data centers going to be operational if you're having a generation facility that's going to serve it for 20 years? What happens if technology changes and people go broke and these become dark stores? Everybody familiar with the concept dark stores? If you're in municipal government, you would know this. When retail stores close early, they try to get reassessed for their value because they're dark now. They're not worth as much. The problem in this area is if technology changes and these data centers go dark, who's going to pay that remaining stranded costs on those generation facilities? The PSC, to its wisdom, on all the utility proposals to date to serve data centers, have required financial collateral security to ensure that if they close early, the ratepayer is not going to be stuck with this. You can go to an outside collateral source to recover that stranded cost. That's a big, big issue. And if I get immersed in this stuff, so I'm probably going a lot of detail, but I want you to be aware of the complexity of this. Port Washington, the 3.1 gigawatt demand facility that I talked about, that's in construction now, gonna have huge energy infrastructure to serve that area. Oracle, which is one of the investors along with OpenAI in that facility, was challenging the Public Service Commission's requirement to have a fiscal security for that facility because they said it was gonna be so expensive. Well, yesterday, they just withdrew their objection. But you can imagine how important that is on the stranded cost issue to make sure if we're building these data centers and they're going up and we're putting in this extraordinary generation that lasts for 20 years, that if technology changes, if these go dark, there is financial security to cover the ratepayers. So we're not stuck with it. So that's when we talk about stranded costs, that's a very important issue on these large facilities. I referenced a little bit about recent PSC decisions on who's paying for all these when we're talking about generation. I think there's good news to report there if you're looking after your interests as a ratepayer. I think the Public Service Commission gets it, that we don't want the ratepayers to be stuck with something if these costs should be allocated, but it's not that simple. Because a lot of the generation that's going in, the utilities are going to say it's not just for it's not just for the data centers, it's to serve existing load. And let me give you an example of this. You have storm-related events here. You know what happens during storms, right? You get interruption of service, right? With tree limbs, etc. We are dealing in utility territories with sometimes 80-year-old distribution assets. These have to be replaced. And this is one of the reasons when you look at We Energy's facilities program, they're talking about $20 billion. This isn't just for data centers. So the big issue here is when we have these facilities going in, is it just to serve data centers? Or is it going to be the need for the rest of the ratepayers? These are very important issues that you have to be vigilant on as a ratepayer going forward. There is a big issue right now. American Transmission Company is putting in a $2 billion new line to help serve the Vantage facility that's going in Port Washington. And remember, it's the FERC that deals with how that cost is allocated, not the Public Service Commission. There's a big issue right now that's working out right now with the transmission company as to whether they're going to work with the PSC and FERC to ensure a new tariff that only the data center pays for this cost. That's in play right now as we're talking about it. It's another complication, but I want you to understand these are some of the issues that we're trying to solve with in a complicated energy environment on who regulates what. Nuclear. Anybody familiar with Dow Chemical, the company? They have a large chemical manufacturing facility in Texas. You know what their proposal is to serve? They have about a 35 megawatt demand of power. To give you an idea when I'm using these terms, how big is a megawatt? I had the ability to tour the Charter Steel plant in Saukville, Wisconsin. Up until recently, they were the largest user of energy in We Energy's territory. They would take in scrap metal, melt it with electric furnaces, and when they were melting those, using those furnaces, their demand was about 60 megawatts at that time, okay? So that gives you an idea of sort of, you know, how big 35 megawatts of demand is that I'm talking about Dow Chemical. Everybody follow me so far? For their chemical plant, to serve that chemical plant. They are proposing to serve that whole chemical plant by small-scale nuclear. And NERC, which is the Federal Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission, has just approved the environmental impact statement to put that small-scale nuclear facility in to serve them. Why am I talking about this? You may be asking yourself, why doesn't the data centers build their own energy, right? Why don't they put their own facilities in? Well, folks, we're in a regulated monopoly system in Wisconsin. Each of these utilities have a monopoly over generation of energy in their territory. The exception to that is if you can put sufficient energy resources on your property and get off the grid, you can do that. What's the problem right now? Look at the size of these data centers. They're already using an enormous amount of space. How would you ever be able to get more space? And they're not in the business, they say, of developing energy. They want to rely on the utility. And plus you have a monopoly system. You can build generation behind the meter for your own property needs. But in these data centers, it had to be so enormous, you would need a lot of property, right? If you want to put solar, wind, they all want to be renewable. They want to have decrease their carbon. That's their whole footprint of Microsoft, AI, they're all over that. Why am I talking about small-scale nuclear? Trump is all in. I don't want to be business disrespectful. President Trump is all in on small-scale nuclear. And he is trying to fast-track the manufacturing of small-scale nuclear at manufacturing facilities and truck them to areas to serve what would we think would be data centers. All this isn't going to happen tomorrow. And this is extraordinarily complex on how we regulate nuclear facilities. Can you imagine the public opposition that will occur if you're putting small-scale nuclear in data centers? But again, this shows you how technology is changing so quickly. And are we going to need these large-scale electrical generation if another 5 or 6 years, these data centers have the ability to be served by small-scale nuclear? And that becomes safe, etc. I want to use this as an example. I meet in my course, I meet 2.5 hours one time a week at night. I devoted my last session in my class in the spring chapter just to small-scale nuclear in terms of the regulation issues, because I think this is coming. And it's going to be something we have to think about in terms of that. I'll just say something about emerging noise and ambient temperature changes. Anybody, when you go to shop at Walmart or wherever you shop, take a look and drive behind and look up on the roof and take a look at the refrigeration equipment and the fans that are floating around. They're buzzing, all right? Because they're blowing off heat. Magnify that by how many times when you're talking about the dissipation, the heat coming out of data centers and how much fans are being used to blow that off with cooling towers, etc. There are concerns about noise because of the amount of fans when you magnify that. And I'm not saying it's something you should be extraordinarily concerned about, but it's an issue. There also is a study by Cambridge University that is not peer-reviewed, so it's not necessarily reliable. But that study had done a study of the ambient air temperature change within a certain distance of data centers. And they are monitoring a degree change of 3 to 4 degrees because of the amount of heat that's flowing out of those centers. Now that's not peer-reviewed, but I think these are, again, merging issues that people need to think about and how you do this. So what is my solution? I'm up here, I'm talking about all this stuff. Do I have any ideas? Well, I'm just going to throw out some ideas, and I'm sure I will get your reaction in all kinds of ways. But let me read my solution, okay? Number one, this is a suggested approach for proposed data centers in communities. Number one, open and transparent discussions between local officials and proposed data center developers. NDAs are damaging in public confidence and avoids discussion about legitimate community concerns and how they will be addressed early in the approval process. I think there's so much misinformation that's coming out after the fact that it's important to engage the community up front in the initial stages of discussions so these issues can be addressed as part of the process of quote-unquote approving data centers on a community-based situation. I think the lack of transparency is a huge problem. Like I said, I teach an energy course. What I tell, and I teach to engineers, MBA, business students, and law students all in the same class. I tell them, you get all the permits you want for a great renewable energy project, but you are going to be met in no uncertain terms with somebody saying, not in my backyard. And what you need to do before you get any permits, you have to engage the best community affairs people you have and sit down in kitchens and talk to people about what their concerns are and deal with those issues in a legitimate, real way up front before you disclose and get permits. That is a big part of my course. And I can give you all kinds of examples where I was involved representing developers on energy projects that were fabulous. And after we got all the permitting, people came out of the woodworks and killed the project. So I think transparency is incredibly important, number one. Number two, generally speaking, there should be little or no tax incremental financing support for developers that have sufficient available financing in the private markets for these projects. This is a big, big controversy right now in Port Washington in terms of providing tax incremental financing, all under NDAs. My view is, and it's easy for me to say, I'm not a municipal official, and you're always worried about losing some tax increment, well, for the reasons I talked about at the outset. But when you are talking about Oracle, when you are talking about Microsoft, when you are talking about Meta, these people, these developers, have more value than most countries. And I don't believe, I think it's a mistake to offer all these communities offering tax incremental funding. That's just my personal viewpoint on seeing this issue. And I do a lot of work with municipalities on contaminated properties, municipal brownfields, where you have to encourage people to come in. Those are legitimate things. The attraction of these big increments, people are going to drool over this about giving tax incremental financing. I think it should be resisted, and if they want to go somewhere else, if some other community wants to give them that, and have these issues of long-term, what if the store goes dark, who's going to pay for it? Those are issues that people struggle with if you have long-term tax incremental financing. So that's number two. Number three, developers should be offering community-based support beyond simply attractive tax increments. The Village of DeForest model provided an attractive model for such additional community-based investment by data developers. Let me just read what they were proposing. DeForest may provide us with two lessons at the same time. First, communities have considerable negotiating leverage when a multi-billion-dollar data center wants to locate there. DeForest negotiated not simply property taxes, but a guaranteed tax base, $50 million in community investment, affordable housing, environmental funding, infrastructure protections, protections for neighborhood homeowners, and protections for utility customers on their property value. They were offering, as part of that deal, to guarantee 10% above the appraised value if people were concerned about their house being impacted and their property wasn't being taken for the facility. They were offering guarantees as part of that project. And they did it, ladies and gentlemen, without tax incremental financing. Now, but the second lesson may be equally important about DeForest. A municipality can negotiate what appears to be, on paper, to be a very favorable economic agreement and still lose support if citizens believe the process was conducted without sufficient transparency. With projects this large and controversial, the process by which a community reaches a decision may be almost as important as the economic terms of the decision itself. And what happened in DeForest, this is outside of Madison, that was all negotiated behind closed doors. They announced it. It was really a pretty good deal if you looked at it. People were outraged that there wasn't engagement and that it was all done without public input. But to me, if that had been done, and this is me easy quarterbacking, if that had been done with public transparency at early stages, talking about the offers that were part of this deal, no tax incremental financing, I think we would have seen a potential for a different result. So for whatever it's worth, these are sort of my thoughts on how a community should be thinking about this and public officials. It's challenging. Municipalities are revenue constrained. There are closing hours on libraries. I mean, as Nick said, I was president of the Milwaukee Public Library. Every budget we were fighting to make sure we had adequate hours because of the constraints that municipalities have on revenues, because of the legislation that has been passed that puts limits on how much you can tax, levy limits, and what's your source of revenue. So this stuff is attractive to the municipalities for good reason. But transparency is so important, and we are dealing with earth-changing dimensions of the energy that's needed to serve these data centers, and to make sure we're vigilant that the ratepayers are not stuck with this and that it goes with the data centers. So Nick, I think at that point I'll close my open remarks and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Art Harrington. So, Art can take questions, raising hands. I will come to you, give me a few hands up. All right, Tom, right there. While I make my way to the back, maybe you could charm everybody with your local connections.
Oh, Connie, my wife, is here. She's a longtime resident, grew up in Beloit. She's here with her sister and brother-in-law. She's one of 8 siblings, grew up on Bluff Street. And her brother Jim, who's not here today, owns the house. And so we get to Beloit frequently and just love the community. So.
Okay, I live in Janesville. Janesville has a 250-acre plot. Used to be General Motors and Jatco, the Janesville Motor Transit Company. The idea is they want to put a data center there, 800 megawatts data center, in the middle of a residential area. I mean, when GM started in 1919, there wasn't a lot of houses around it, but now it is completely, surrounded by, if you think about 1/4 of the population of Janesville, we're talking about 17,000 residents. I'm sorry, I've got Parkinson's, so I forget it. But the thing is, they're thinking it's going to be an $8 billion project. I asked one of our city council members a question before our latest election. Do you know of any data center that's going into a brownfield? It's a brownfield because of what GM did to the area, that has remediated that field and put a data center on it. The person didn't answer my question, but it just seems very irresponsible to me that they want to put that kind of power with that kind of heat problem, the noise problem. I have 24/7 tinnitus, so I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, to have noise constantly and lights on constantly. So we've been fighting this for over a year, wondering what else we can say to them to maybe decide not to do it. Thank you.
Well, let me give you a little bit of my background when I respond to this. I am chairman of the board for the Kenosha Innovation Neighborhood. It's a $25 million, 60,000 square foot new technology center on 107 acres, built on the former Chrysler engine site.
in Kenosha after it was shut down, the Chrysler Banks. And I'm just gonna tell you a little more about that in response to your question. The city, through grants and tax incremental financing, we got in a big fight with the Chrysler bankruptcy. I had the privilege, our firm did, to represent the city on that fight, to get control over the site and get all the buildings down in a responsible way, with no funding for environmental cleanup on that site. We did a deal, Treasury came with $10 million to help with the cleanup, the city took title, all the buildings went down. Fast forward 15 years later, the city, through tax incremental financing and grants, has put in $80 million to clean up that facility, that site. And that includes building a brand new technology center as a way to kind of repurpose this historical site. I think it is challenging for Janesville. I mean, GM Janesville, Kenosha Chrysler, two peas in a pod. Retransforming yourself, how are you gonna transform it? The attraction for tax increments gotta be big for Janesville. I would emphasize some of the things I talked about at the end of my presentation. Making sure that if the data center goes in, they're gonna protect homeowners through some kind of market value guarantee. I do a lot of work in the environmental area, been involved with landfills that wanna expand. Waste management, you know what waste management does every time they wanna expand their facilities? There's always upset landowners around. They guarantee a buyout of a certain amount above market price to protect those individuals. To me, that's a starting point that you should demand. The noise issues, you wanna get some consultants to make sure. I would wanna make sure that you had adequate protection. In addition to the tax increments, I think there should be investment in the community, like I talked about. This is not as satisfying. I think you're right to be concerned about environmental costs. My suspicion is Janesville has given a lot of thought to that. They're a large community. That's automotive manufacturer there for 100 years, right? One of the largest GM plants in the country. How much do they know about the subsurface? I think it's a legitimate issue. And who's gonna pay for that if there's issues when they start developing that and uncover contaminated soil? Is that gonna be a city responsibility? Is the developer gonna be able to do it? And does the developer have the wherewithal? Those are all legitimate questions. I think they could be answered in a reliable way if you have open and transparent discussions and people are doing that, but that would be my response, and I've lived through this. I'm a Kenosha, I'm born and raised in Kenosha. My sister until recently was the 5th generation of our family in the same house. When I was growing up, 14,000 people were employed at working motors. And to see that transition occur in Kenosha was heartbreaking. But Beloit has gone through the same thing with all the manufacturing that has transitioned. Good leadership, I think good community-based support, business leaders stepping up, providing the support for these kind of questions, I think is all a hopeful solution. Something's got to be done with that site. There's no question. It's going to be a drag on the value for the city if you don't do something that can repurpose it. Whether it's a data center, I don't know, but it's right now, it's what's being discussed. And you just want to make sure they have the financial wherewithal to do what I'm recommending on my closing remarks. That's my thought. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have a question here next. Give us a hand.
Any number of times you've mentioned stranded assets. That was, for the most part, in conjunction with the responsibilities of the public utilities. But the reason the assets will be stranded, apparently, is because technology has changed sufficiently so that the underlying data centers assets also are stranded. You're probably aware that the humongous amount of financing that's going on right now is in many cases debt financing. So we're talking about not only the public utilities being owners of stranded assets, we're talking about actually the original investors in the facilities, and what's being done to make sure that there's any kind of redress for these people other than bankruptcy.
You raised an excellent point, and let me give you a real example. I mentioned during my prepared remarks
that Oracle was challenging, Vantage was challenging the requirement for collateral security for serving generation at that facility, saying it was gonna be too expensive. Their debt rating was downgraded recently to BBB minus. That's one step above junk bonds in terms of the way they're gonna finance issues like that. So it's a very important issue. And that's why you need collateral security, separate, like an insurance policy, that the utilities, or maybe even the communities should be required. You don't wanna have a dark store that suddenly is not making an increment if this thing shuts down after 5 or 10 years. Even if you're not providing tax incremental financing, how is that gonna be repurposed? So you're raising some good issues. I don't have great examples. Usually that's required somehow by developer security if you're doing tax incremental financing. But you're raising issues that even if this facility goes in, what if it shuts down early for default reasons, even if there isn't any incremental financing? What happens to that facility? How is it repurposed? Maybe the community should be thinking about securitizing against that obligation. You following me? I mean, I think these are all legitimate issues that are not easy, but we should learn by what's happened in the past. Is that, any other follow-up questions on that? Okay.
We go right here.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could give some examples of what a transparent process looks like practically.
You know, this is I was an alderman in my hometown community of Mequon. And I had the experience of going through a tax incremental financing project, an industrial park. And it is not easy to attract developers without talking about a non-disclosure agreement, because they don't want anybody to know what they're doing. So I understand the need for non-disclosures when you were having initial conversations. But my own view is, at some point, the community has to tell that entity, while we have a non-disclosure agreement, before we're gonna approve anything, we want a process where you and others are gonna go out and talk to people before any commitments are made. That would be my view of how to deal with this. I think there's a legitimate issue that any developer that comes in wants a non-disclosure agreement at the outset, and there are exceptions to public records law for that reason, when you're negotiating something. But I think we do it too much in the traditional way, where everything is closed book up until you're gonna get common council approval, and then it goes bright. It's gotta go bright much earlier than that. That's my view. Yes.
So I'm just thinking, like, it's on, you would describe it as being the developer should be doing the communication, and the kind of, the municipality is the one requiring that, or making sure that that's happening.
Well, you know, here's the problem if you're a municipal official, right? You can't necessarily be an advocate. You're a decision maker representing the public. My view, it's the developer's obligation to go out there and engage the community and have discussions. And my own view is, and maybe this is wrong, my own view is you don't do it in a public meeting with 150 people there. It is not going to be a productive discussion. They have to spend the time to go into the community and talk one-on-one to neighborhoods, and I think that's the developer's obligation. And if they don't know how to do it, they should get a good communications firm who knows how to do this and deal with it. Because you're going to hear issues that can be solvable with a proposed approach if you know what those issues are up front. I mentioned as part of my closing remarks, people's concern about how is noise and everything affect my property value. Well, maybe one solution is to give somebody a guarantee over and above their market value if they want to, if they're concerned about that. You know, there are solutions if you know what those issues are in front. Let me just give you one example of this. I represented the Oneida Seventh Generation Corporation in Green Bay. That's the development arm for the Oneida Tribe. They had a great energy project where they were going to take all the waste that was going into Brown County landfill that had plastic and BTU of value. And rather than going into landfill, they were going to put it in a closed system called pyrolysis and bake it to a certain temperature with no releases and create a natural gas that was then going to generate that was gonna power a generator for Alliant Energy, that was Wisconsin Public Service. They were required to take green energy, that would have qualified. It was a great project. We got all the permitting. Suddenly, a group from outside of Green Bay came in, and we got conditional use permit to start building this, the thing was being built. A group came out outside of Green Bay and claimed this was incineration of chemicals. It was gonna be horribly dangerous to the community. That was not the case. This is like burning natural gas. In your home, when you had natural gas and you have a vent pipe, that's what this was. The Common Council, after they heard this, reversed their conditional use permit before we could even address it. All because these issues came out of nowhere after all the permits were given. I can give you 3 or 4 other examples like this. I personally thought it was a great project. You were using renewable energy, you're taking stuff out of the landfill with methane coming out and using it for energy. This is one example of many where if you don't deal and be sensitive to public opposition, your project is doomed for failure.
We can do 2 more questions right here, and then Senator Spreitzer, I'll bring it over there.
The idea of data centers is new to this area, so we're all trying to learn about it. In particular, in the towns of Beloit and Turtle is this larger size. So my understanding is there are quite a few data centers in America, just not of the size that's being proposed. Can you give any insight as to how many existing ones are in the country of the size that's being proposed here? And I don't have the details on how big the one is here in locally. And then I've heard that every X number of years, say 5 years, they have to replace things inside or the actual computer thing. So some validity to that, I guess. And as technology changes, you alluded to chips and things will use less energy. Maybe just touch on that.
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you, I'm not a data center expert on the computer side. I teach energy, okay? And I'm an environmental energy lawyer. I read as much as I can about data centers. I think if you want to look at enormous data centers that set a precedent, look in Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., and also look at Texas. There are some enormous facilities that are going into those 2 states. Elon Musk is putting in, he's doing his own generations, he's putting gas turbines in to support a mammoth data center. So I can't precisely tell you centers that have operated that are larger than this, but there are many already, and they're gonna get bigger. But I would say take a look and do some, using AI, look at what's happening in Virginia and Texas and see what comes up. The issue on replacing equipment, yes, there's no question. This equipment's going to be replaced and changed because of the chips, how they're changing, and the efficiencies. And also, let me just give an example. Again, I am not an expert on AI or the technology needed to support it. Anybody familiar with DeepSeek in China in terms of an AI model? DeepSeek came out within the last year, and they have used a different approach for doing data searches. When you do a data search right now on AI, Anthropic, etc., ChatGPT, you're going through the universe of data that's available in the web. DeepSeek has a system and a model that will program a very targeted research. You're not going through the whole web. As a result, it's using much less energy because you're not going through all the servers. This is just one example of technology and how it's changing on the AI side. The chips as well. I mean, if you know where 90% of the NVIDIA chips are manufactured? Taiwan. It says TMCR, I think, is the foundry for chips. There are so many missiles from outer space that could derail this, including watch out with China right now in Taiwan. Not a very good answer, but I think we are dealing with issues in real time right now, and technology is changing so quickly that I'm not going to be sitting here predicting how often they have to change it, what's going to happen with the chips, are they going to need less space, how this cooling technology could make them more dense and not require them to be as large as they are. These are all interesting issues that are evolving as we're speaking.
Art, we're gonna go ahead and let Senator Spreitzer bring us home.
Awesome, okay.
I wanted to go back to energy use because I didn't hear that in your recommendations, and it's obviously something that our local communities don't have much say over that we need to address state and nationally. But it feels to me like even if you solve the community benefit agreement and noise mitigation and reduce water usage, you come back to the fact that hyperscale data centers are fundamentally incompatible with our energy goals, whether that's trying to decarbonize or just not wanting things on the landscape. And I'm a supporter of solar much more than fossil fuels, but the scale of solar we're seeing is deeply, deeply unpopular, covering multiple towns. I don't see how that is a
You
sustainable
don't have an
solution
easy solution,
here.
Senator?
So to me, I keep coming back to you could regulate everything else about these, and I just don't see the answer on energy. Do you?
I think it is hard to predict how this is going to play out because this is happening in real time and it is completely upending what we've done on our energy infrastructure here by going from fossil fuel to solar and wind. This is going to have to be a complete reversal and how that plays out. And I can tell you, and I'm not being critical of utilities. They listen, they have to serve the public, they have to go through PSC. But they are very interested in facilities because they're capital intensive and they get a return that is the quid pro quo agreement with the PSC. So there is a lot of interest in utilities figuring out how they can build this generation because their shareholders are going to benefit, which, that's the compact we made 100 years ago by having investor-owned utilities. I just think, and I'll tell you one thing that I think needs to be done, Senator. Citizens Utility Board, Tom Content, is doing miraculous work with a very limited staff, representing consumers and small residential, small retailers. They get a pittance out of your utility bill for supporting what they do. I think if there's something the legislature can do, one of the quickest things you could do is increase what they should be entitled to receive from that utility bill. They are representing, as much as I like to say the Public Service Commission is, they're navigating the regulated monopoly and the consumers. Citizens Utility Board is representing all of us in this room, and they need to be adequately funded. They have a staff of 4 people. They have an economist. They have 2 lawyers. Tom Content, former energy reporter for the Journal Sentinel, spectacular guy. They are outclassed. They have to deal on alternate years with every rate approach that is filed at the same time. We Energy is the 1 year. Within 120 days, they have to get all their comments. Then the other 4 investor-owned utilities the next year, in 120 days, they have to get all their comments to what they're asking for. My thought right now, near term, is adequately fund the Citizens Utility Board. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I think you can see why I was so impressed and thought he would be perfect for the Civics Academy. Thank you, Art, for this presentation. Check our website for upcoming Civics Academy. Grab some cookies and some water, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks.